Hello and welcome to Historical Horror. This week is about the dreadful destinies of people who worked in the most terrifying mines in history. All mines are dangerous and difficult places, but these were so terrible that nearly no one would choose to work there, so they had to be forced. Many didn't last long, and the last of these mines was so bad it was considered a fate worse than execution. Viewer discretion is advised. In the Imperial Russia of early 1889, Yelizaveta Kovalskaya learnt that the Governor-General of the area of Russia known as Amur, Baron Korff, was coming for a visit. Yelizaveta had been a member of Narodnaya Volya, or People's Will. They were a socialist militant group that liked to bump off government officials and things like that. When they caught her in 1881, they wanted to punish her in a way that took her out of the public eye, but also wouldn't make her into a martyr, so they sent her to the Kara Katorgas. Katorgas were what Russia had before the gulags. Like the gulags, they were based in Siberia in the freezing cold, and they were a place for anyone that they wanted the people of Russia to forget about. They weren't all mines, but the mine katorgas were reserved for the most dangerous prisoners, criminally and politically. For example, famous novelist and political agitator Fyodor Dostoevsky spent time in one from 1849 to 1854. He described it as a ceaseless, merciless assault on my soul. The Kara Katorgas, where they put Yelizaveta, were gold mines built on the Kara River in Siberia. They were the worst of them all. The good thing, or rather the less lousy thing, about being held as a political prisoner, especially a female one, is that in theory you were better looked after. You worked fewer hours, you were allowed to write letters, had recreation time, and most importantly, you weren't beaten. But everyone else was, often with a nut, a heavy whip which they'd add whatever they could to make it more painful. 100 lashes were considered a death sentence. Some people were beaten thousands of times. But she didn't always get easy. Even though she usually avoided beatings, Yelizaveta was still regularly stripped naked just to humiliate her. Avoid that sort of thing, she had to work relentlessly, often in total darkness, for up to 12 hours at a time with virtually no food. Like all the other miners, she was bound to other prisoners with heavy shackles that made her weak, and then those shackles were held by rivets to heavy carts, draining even more of the little energy she had. Some of her comrades fell because of exhaustion, others to the wrath of guards who didn't care who they were, and many lost their lives to the poisonous gases that were so toxic that people in nearby villages couldn't raise their livestock close to the mines. Yelizaveta was a troublemaker. She had a habit of escaping or trying to and causing chaos. On the day of the Baron's visit, the prisoners were told to stand in his presence. Yelizaveta refused, even when the prison guards poked her with their bayonets. That was an insult big enough for the commandant in charge at the time to decide that from then onward, political prisoners and women would be treated the same as everyone else. That night, Yelizaveta was dragged out of bed into the cold Siberian air. She was stripped naked, beaten, and dumped in a train car, which took her to a boat which took her 70 miles to another Katorga at Streninsk. When word got around how badly she'd been treated, some of her fellow revolutionaries went on hunger strike. The strikes went on for months, taking out nearly 200 people from their workforce, but there was no sign of the commandant backing down. It was in the middle of this turmoil that Nadezhda Sigida turned up. Nadezhda had been arrested for running a printing press, making leaflets for People's Will. In August 1889, not long after she got to the Katorga, she joined the second round of hunger strikes. On August 31st, the commandant called the striking women into his office for a little chat. Well, more of a chance to threaten them, really. Nadezhda decided that a different kind of strike might do the job better, so she slapped the commandant across his face, or at least tried to. How successful she was differs depending on the sources you read. But it was enough of an insult that she was moved to the main prison block to live with the worst criminals Russia had to offer. The next day, 3 more women started a new hunger strike to get her out. It failed. Instead, they ended up in the same place as Nadezhda. The people in charge decided to make an example of Nadezhda. Baron Korff sentenced her to 100 lashes with the knot. Afterwards, she was in so much pain that she overdosed on purpose on hospital morphine. In protest, 23 of her comrades did the same. But because the morphine at the mine was so weak, morphine's expensive stuff and they can't waste it on helping prisoners with their pain, most of them survived. but Nadezhda and 5 others didn't. It caused a public outcry. The Karakatogas were shut down and they banned the use of corporal punishment against women and political prisoners. The other prisoners still had it just as bad as before. Between 1801 and 1917, more than 1 million people were sent to the Katogas. Thousands of them didn't make it out. Many perished at Kara. But at least in that mine, they could get out one day and they were treated like human beings. In the next 2 stories, the miners weren't so lucky. Bengzihu was the worst mining disaster on record, and the way the miners were treated is a big part of why it was so bad. One of those miners was Zhai Wenhua. He didn't sign up to go down the mine. He was one of a 600-person Chinese battalion that was captured by the Japanese in April 1941. At the time, China was, initially at least, on the losing side of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a conflict that would become part of the Second World War. After capture, he was first led to the Pingyao concentration camp in the Shaanxi province. It was a brutal place. When one Chinese soldier jumped into a well to end themselves, the Japanese army led the rest of that group, more than 600 men, into a ravine and finished them off with a machine gun. No matter how bad things were at Pingyao, it would only get worse. Later that year, they put Wenhua on the back of a truck to another concentration camp. He and his fellow prisoners starved so severely that around 20 people passed every day. They wanted the men to be thin. Then, Wenhua was loaded onto another truck and taken to the coal mine at Bengzihu. Wenhua shared one room with 70 others in a house surrounded by guards. At night, he was forced to strip naked and sleep on a high wooden platform with his fellow prisoners. The ladder would be taken down every night so they couldn't escape. If he needed to go to the bathroom, he had to go nude, and it was freezing cold. It was part of a process of control and dehumanization, but it was better than what happened during the day. In the morning, Wenhua was given a meal: acorn flour, some frozen potatoes, and a porridge made from sorghum rice. That's all he ever got to eat. Then he was escorted to the mine, where he was yelled at, humiliated, and usually beaten. They forced him into narrow seams where he could barely move his pickaxe, but if he slowed for a second, he would get his head hit by his superior's axe handle. If he answered back, it got worse still. One of Wenhua's co-workers, a man called Wang, was fed to wolves for standing up for himself. Another, Yin Hui, was forced to eat feces soup until he starved after talking back to his boss. Some lost their lives to typhoid, some to cholera, and others to accidents. There are accidents every day. On one occasion, for example, the team Wenhua was working with lost control of one of the carts they used to bring the iron ore to the surface. To save time, they'd ride the cart into the elevator, but this time, the elevator wasn't there. The cart fell down the shaft, taking the lives of everyone inside. Luckily for Wenhua, he'd chosen to walk. Often, lives were taken rather than lost. When one of his fellow prisoners got his arm crushed by falling coal, instead of wasting time and energy trying to dig him out, the guard in charge struck him on the head with giant pliers until he stopped moving. If you were sick, you were beaten. If you looked like your life was about to end, they would remove your clothes and give them to someone else before you were gone. It's fair to say the people running the place didn't care about their workforce. But there were some specialist jobs and some people were paid wages. Sort of. For example, some of the seams were so small that even the starved soldiers couldn't get down them. So instead, they hired children. Shang Bayode was 14 years old when his parents learnt about working in the mines. They were farmers who lived 360 miles away in Xiaojiangjia. Because of the war, they were struggling. A promise of good food, money, a multi-storey house, electricity, telephones and running water sounded magical. When they got there, there was electricity, but not much else. Bayode was separated from his family and given so little money he couldn't feed himself. It was better than the prisoners, but still brutal. He only had one set of clothes, and the conditions in the mine were terrible. He also witnessed the beatings and the humiliation. He and his family, once they got there, couldn't leave, because they couldn't afford to. On the morning of April 26, 1942, Wenhua had a bout of diarrhea so bad that even though they dragged him to the entrance, forced his head inside, and beat him, it was clear he was of no use. If it hadn't been for a friend covering his shift, he might well have been beaten until he could never work again. Young Bayode was working with 4 other people at the mine entrance. The rain had been pouring and they were all trying to not get soaked. When another downpour started, Bayodé and his colleagues moved about 100 metres into the entrance to keep dry. Then there was a massive explosion. Clouds of coal dust that had been floating about in the tunnels below for weeks, months, probably years, had caught a spark. A giant rush of air threw Bayodé out of the entrance and knocked him unconscious by the winch they used to control the mine's elevator. He just missed the winch cable, which then fell on top of him when the elevator broke free from it. A few inches one way and he would have been sliced in two. From the mining village, Wenhua could see the pillars of flame shoot out of the entrance into the sky. The heat and the noise of those pillars of flames woke Bayodé up. When he looked around, he saw that one of the people working with him, Ma, had hit the concrete support holding the winch in place so hard that, to quote Bayodé, he'd smashed into a meat pie. When he visited the mine's hospital, he discovered that he, luckily, had just got some cuts and bruises. Wenhua rushed to the mine to see if he could help despite his sickness. He discovered that the Japanese army had decided to electrify the perimeter fence, shut the gate and seal the pit entrance. They also shut off all the ventilation to try to choke the fire. Wenhua knew that anyone who hadn't escaped had no chance of survival. The fire raged for a day, and then the cleanup began. Wenhua and the others were sent to recover whatever they could. It took 10 days, and they couldn't get to everyone. Those they could get to were thrown into mass graves. The stench in the mine was almost unbearable, mainly because of the people who were still trapped down there. The Japanese tried pouring wine into the mine to reduce the odour, but nothing worked. But still, they kept mining. The coal was too precious to be left underground during a war. At the time, the Japanese Imperial Army claimed that 1,327 people had lost their lives. Some people who were there believe it was closer to 3,000. The actual number is believed to be 1,549, making it the most lethal mining disaster and the second worst industrial accident on record. But compared to the mines of ancient Rome, that's a drop in the ocean. We only know the boy as Germanus. His name didn't really matter. All that mattered was that he'd been captured when his German tribe fought with the Romans. Now he was their property to do with as they pleased. He was part of a dark truth that held up the Roman Empire. The power of their armies and their vast wealth and resources would mean nothing without a significant number of people they enslaved. And by significant, I mean somewhere between 19 and 30% of the population, or between 9.5 and 50 million people at any time were enslaved. We don't know too much about Germanus either, but we do know he worked at a mine in Spain, passed away in the 2nd century CE, and was just 15 years old when he did. We also know he was owned by someone called Marinus. The good news is that it's unlikely he'd be doing the job for more than 5 years. One reason for that is that kids under 5 weren't allowed to work, even though they were still the property of whoever owned their mothers. In fact, one of the grossest things about Roman enslavement is that the price of a fertile woman was much higher than at any other time in her life. Partly because that's when she'd be physically fittest, and partly, and this is a really gross part, because it was cheaper to inherit her children than it was to buy one at the market. We also know he wouldn't have been doing the job for more than 10 years because it's rare that the miners lasted anything like that long. Germanus was odd though. Usually, any enslaved people in the mines were the state's property, either because they'd been fighting on the wrong side, like he had, or because they'd done some crimes so terrible that fighting with wild animals in the arena and crucifixion were too good for them. But even though someone owned Germanus, he, like all the enslaved people in the empire, would most likely have been regularly tortured and the victim of SA. That's before he got into a mine. In ancient Rome, most of the mining was open cast, but some happened underground. According to a Greek historian called Agathocaides, adults in the mine would make their way through shafts not high enough to standing, wearing dim lamps on their head. Once inside, they would smash through the rock with pickaxes and hammers. Then, Germanus and the other children would scurry around them, grabbing all the broken stones they could and carrying them outside. There'd be no cart to help them, and if they paused for a second, they'd be severely beaten. What made these mines the worst in history is that although they share a lot with the way people were treated in Begzihu and in the Katorgas, the miners here were thought of as completely disposable. They were less important than the beasts of burden or the mining equipment. If they broke, they were just thrown away. All the miners were naked because they wouldn't be alive long enough to need clothes. There was no rest, no respite. Adults, children, men and women were expected to work non-stop, day and night, until their bodies gave up. Until they were crushed, poisoned, got trapped in a rock grinder, or crushed by one of the water wheels used to pump the mines out, or mangled in some other equipment that they were forced to operate. Germanus was relatively lucky. The reason we've heard about him is because when his body gave in, he at least got a memorial. Probably because he was privately owned. That means he had some value to somebody. But for most miners, what was left of you would be dragged out and dumped in a mass grave, and another from the endless supply of millions of enslaved people would take your place. How many people passed in the Roman mines in Spain and elsewhere is hard to know, but it may have been in the millions. I hope you liked our trip into the most gruesome mines in history. Which of these three do you think was the worst? Would you rather have your rights taken away than risk a massive explosion? Or do you like the idea of being a revolutionary more than anything else? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this far, and if you did like it, there's a button you can use to prove it nearby, and another one that helps you to know when my next video is dropping that's called subscribe or something. If you'd like to support this growing channel, there's a link to my Patreon just below and hopefully just above. There, you'll not just get early access to videos, extra videos where I talk about the science more, live streams where we can chat and I can prove that I'm a real person, opportunities to pick topics and share them, and access to my exclusive Discord where I'll be doing all sorts of things. In the meantime, stay gross. Gross is good.